Hi everyone, good morning, good afternoon and good evening. My name is Micheala Chan and I'm an engineer based in the UK. I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar on the lessons learned from the Turkey and Syria earthquake. So as many of you might know, in February, on the 6th of February 2023, at 4:17 local time, a 7.8 magnitude earthquake rocked southeast Turkey near the Syrian border. So today I have with me two great engineers, Wafa and Mark, to talk about their experiences in the aftermath of this earthquake. But first, I want to hand over to Mustafa Shehu, who is the president-elect of the World Federation of Engineering Organizations, to give a brief opening statement.
Thank you very much. Micheala. Thank you very much, the chairman of Young Engineers Future Leaders Committee of the World Federation of Engineering Organizations. Let me say I'm very delighted to be invited to this webinar in which discussions will be held on the effect of the earthquake in Turkey and Syria and how it affects the world over. This is a topic actually that is very important to all of us as engineers and also as human beings, because it has affected a lot of people, a death toll of more than 59,000 people. And out of these 59,000 people, about 50,000 are from Syria and from Turkey, and over 8,000 from Syria. So this is really a very serious earthquake, a very sad event, which is actually the deadliest in modern history, because in the last centuries, we have not had this kind of magnitude earthquake. And it also damaged a lot of area, more than 350,000 square kilometer of space. Imagine such a very big landmass, more than many countries. I believe country like Germany is not more than 350,000 square kilometer. So for a single event or sequence of events to happen, within a very short time to affect this kind of people, it is very it's a very big issue socially and technically. Another effect of this earthquake is also the fact that it has affected a lot of people. More than 14 million people are affected, and more than 1.5 million people were actually rendered homeless. So imagine, for somebody to find himself, his house is destroyed, it's very serious issue. And as we are engineers, it is our concern to actually investigate what has really caused this earthquake. What are the immediate and remote causes for this earthquake, and what can we do as engineers to prevent future occurrences? What can we do in our the designs of buildings of today, to make sure that while we cannot prevent earthquake, but we can also prevent or limit the effect of earthquake on in our buildings. So this is actually what has brought us to hear from experts. How can we look at the future in designing our buildings, in constructing our buildings, to make sure that the effect of earthquake do not devastate our structures and our livelihood. It is in this respect we invited Mr. Mark Skora, who is the operations director of Search and Rescue Assistance in Disaster, SARAID. And we believe he has a lot to contribute to this discussion. And we also have Micheala Chan, who is a civil engineer in Arcadis. Micheala Chan, who is the person who has even introduced me to this particular meeting. We are going to hear from her. She is a civil engineer and she works in a very big consulting company, which is one of the world's leading company, which is known in delivering sustainable design, sustainable engineering consultancy solution for natural and built environment. So we are here, all of us are here globally to hear from these experts. And we are also going to hear from the chairman of the Young Engineers Future Leaders Committee. And so with these few words, I want to welcome everyone to this particular webinar. And I hope the discussion will be very fruitful and much engaging to the benefit of the engineering community globally. So I thank you very much.
Thank you, Mustafa. So before we begin, I'll just quickly run through the program with you all. So we'll start with a panel discussion, and then I'll leave some time for questions from the audience as well. We will be sharing a link to a Google Sheet in the chat where you can input your questions, and I will take them from there when we get to the time for questions. And then Firas, who is the chair of the WFEO Committee on Young Engineers and Future Leaders, will be providing concluding remarks at the end. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce Wafa, who's a civil engineer from Syria, who has experience in site engineering, construction management, and shelter projects, and works with UNHCR in high-risk conflict areas. If you could just give an introduction to yourself and your work, that would be great.
Thank you, Micheala. Thank you, Firas. Thank you for all of you for hosting me. And good morning, good evening, good afternoon for everybody who is attending. I am Wafa, a civil engineer. I am working in Homs in Syria with UNHCR. We have been working since 2015 in the response to the shelter and rehabilitation needs in Homs, Hama, and Idlib. So after the earthquake, we also moved to also shelter to assist people in who they lost their houses. So I have a civil engineering background. I have construction management, also diploma in the construction management in Damascus University. I worked also in general company for engineering studies and a variety of tasks I did, but this is now I am what I am doing now is my current job. Thank you.
No worries. Was there some slides you wanted to share as well? Or... Okay. So Mark, do you want to give a brief background about yourself as well?
Sure. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody, and thanks for inviting me to come and talk to you today. My name is Mark Scorer. As mentioned, my day job is as an earthquake engineer for the engineering consultancy Atkins, which I'm a chief engineer for them, looking at sort of the seismic analysis and design for structures and critical infrastructure around the world. But as part of my role outside of work, I'm the operations director for the charity SARAID, Search and Rescue Assistance in Disasters, and that is the main area of interest that I'd like to share with you today about the recent deployment to Turkey in the immediate aftermath of the two devastating earthquakes there. And I have a few slides to show you, if that's all right now. So we'll just try and share screen to talk you through what myself and some of the team were doing in country for nearly a week back in February. So hopefully you can all see those slides there. As you can see, the picture of devastation that we were met with was fairly stark. The charity is, as mentioned, Search and Rescue Assistance in Disasters. We've been going for nearly 20 years now, and it's a completely voluntary organisation based here in the UK, an NGO, so staffed completely by volunteers and available 24/7, 365 days a year to respond to potential disasters, mainly focused in the urban search and rescue environment, so post-earthquake, potentially post-tsunami, etc. We deployed a team the day after, so on February 7th, into Adana via Istanbul, and then immediately onwards towards Kahramanmaraş. As you can see here, there are a few photos of the road on the way with the issues relating to the railway tracks being bent and buckled, issues to bridges and collapsed structures. Post-event, looking at some of the social media, you can see the left lateral fault slips that was just significant, sort of upwards of 2 meters in some areas, and some of the failure of embankments. And again, I believe this is the same railway line that we passed on the way to Marash. So as a search and rescue team, predominantly our involvement there was initially coordination, setting up a reception and departure center and supporting that in the airport in Adana to manage a lot of incoming teams, of which there were over 200 search and rescue teams. Then we were also helping to facilitate and coordinate the sector coordination cell, of which there were 10 different sector coordination cells set up underneath the UN umbrella in various cities, whether it be Gaziantep, Kahramanmaraş, various different areas, to coordinate the search and rescue teams working in that area. We turned up to our first work site straight off the bus after we'd got a plane into Marash at about 5 or 6 in the evening, met up with our local team that we'd known previously. You can see here the before and after on the left, the apartment block, and the collapse that we'd seen on the right. Our colleagues from Fire had been searching the building during the day, and we joined them to continue the search long into the night. We looked at accessing from the basement because Fire had reached a radiator and a dead end at this point. This involved various digging, excavations, breaking and breaching, some temporary propping and shoring to go in, all the while making engineering assessments between the engineers, that myself and the others that we had within the team, and from Fire as well. Following that, you can see we were then taking highly specialized camera equipment, a 360 camera that we were able to put in through the access that we created. And this is some short footage. Hopefully it works. You can see of when the camera was put into the building. We were fortunate enough to be able to locate a live casualty. Thankfully, the daughter was also alive there, and we managed to get a 6-year-old daughter and her mother safely out of this building. And you can see us making the rescue there. There was then some further assessment that needed to be done to confirm that there was no further casualties within the building, or live casualties within the building, and unfortunately there were not at that time. Some of the work that my colleagues back in sort of the base of operations were involved in, it's important to sectorize the city of Marash in the immediate aftermath to ensure search and rescue teams aren't duplicating effort, and can be designated to a certain sector so they can clear and work through buildings step by step. These taskings would come through AFAD, the Turkish Emergency Disaster Response Committee, and coordinated through the UN sector coordination cells. These are some of the examples of the other taskings that we were deployed to search during our deployment. There was also some remote taskings to the villages beyond outside of Kahramanmaraş, because this had received very little attention in the immediate aftermath. And some of the conditions you can see during the time were very cold. Another work site that we were tasked to, you can see here the before and the after of an 8-story apartment block that was effectively reduced to rubble. And here the team are using highly specialized listening equipment called a DELSAR to effectively listen for any vibrations, both acoustic and seismic, from casualties trapped within the building. On this instance, there was a definite response to a tapping when everybody went quiet, and there was a potential casualty identified. And so a very skilled local excavator driver managed to delaminate the building, removing the floor slabs very carefully to actually uncover a child's hair. And this was done very carefully as the child was still alive. And then with some great support from the local medical teams and the international response teams, we were able to extricate a 15-year-old girl called Iqbal here, who was healthy and well and was more worried about leaving her Harry Potter books behind, and her cat. So that was a very positive end to that situation as well. As you can see here, there's another fairly devastating impact of the earthquake. There were multiple multi-story apartment blocks on the left as a before, and here is the same image on the right now with just collapse after collapse. And this was the situation that we were working in. And that's an overview from drone footage of the same area. All of these buildings had just collapsed with, unfortunately, many lives lost. In total, the UN and international response saved over 250 lives, which is a significant effort, but there was a significant number of personnel that go into this response from 82 countries, a number of search dogs, and a fantastic local presence. All the search and rescue teams and those assisting on the ground from Turkey were fantastic and so supportive, and were doing an unbelievable job. And the reason we keep doing this is because there was always hope. And I think the longest that I read about after the event was over 278 hours in a building that this gentleman was recovered from alive. So that was fantastic. And those are just a few of the slides to set the context of what myself and my team were doing in country. I'm happy to pass it back to you now, Micheala.
Thanks, Mark. So Wafa, I want to come back to you. I think in the news we heard a lot, at least in the UK, about like the impacts of the earthquake in Turkey. But I was wondering if you could give some more context of what it was like on the ground in Syria, and what were some of the biggest challenges you faced working like in a conflict zone.
Thank you, Micheala. I will share a small presentation for that, talking about the situation in Syria. I will talk about the earthquake from the humanitarian side. So the earthquake before Syria, the situation in Syria before the earthquake. So these figures provided let me share the screen properly. Sorry. But these figures were shared by OCHA in the humanitarian needs overview, that the 22.1 million are living in Syria. Figures the population of Syria. 15 million is residents in Syria. 6.8 million are refugees. Among them, there are people in camps, and 84,000 are returnees. I will talk first about the housing conditions in Syria. Of course, not all governorates and the locations in Syria, but in where I work actually, I work in Homs, Hama, and as I told you, the southern part of Idlib. So the housing conditions in Syria, 5.7 million persons are in need for shelter assistance, and their houses were damaged due to the several reasons. The first reason is the conflict itself. So the houses was sometimes destructed and sometimes looted. The houses also, the elements of the houses were looted, like doors, windows, even the electricity. We noticed in some locations electricity, wiring, everything, furniture, fixtures on. Beside the damages, I'm sure that everyone Googles Homs city, you can see a lot of images that reflects the situation. Or Hama rural, actually, the city has not affected. The displacement to collective shelters, the collective shelters were schools mostly. There are some camps in the north of Syria and some informal settlements. So in UNHCR, we have been working since 2015 or more or before on improving the housing conditions for these people. After the earthquake, we continue supporting these people and supporting the housing conditions. Specifically after the earthquake, we do the rehabilitation of collective shelters. Especially the wash facilities, because of most of the schools, they accommodate many families, so they need proper wash facilities, repair of damaged houses, and cash distribution for basic needs, because most of the people who left their houses, or their houses were totally destructed, that they need some cash for their basic needs, rehabilitation of schools, and debris removal. Of course, before the earthquake, we have similar interventions, but for the crisis affected areas only. The government response after the earthquake, there was a very huge efforts done for the surveying of the damaged houses. They conduct rapid surveys, and then through the engineering syndicate, they did evaluation for these houses, and then based on this evaluation, they did evacuation notices to the severely damaged houses, so they evacuate people to collective shelters. Most of the challenges, these are the challenges we face actually during our work. First, the accessibility. It has been and still the accessibility is a concern for us. Some locations has remnants of wars. Some locations is not accessible due to some restrictions. For the fragile structures, you know that from the crisis, from the conflict, the house's condition was fragile. Was like it was hit, and then now after the earthquake, it was also damaged again. So the fragile structure was a challenge. So the poverty of people led people to build houses in informal settlements, or not informal, in organized areas. These in organized areas lacks the minimum standards of safety, and like sometimes they build houses without any columns and any structural elements. This was also hugely affected. The role of engineering offices, the engineering syndicate before the crisis, to monitor and to supervise the implementation of the seismic for the seismic reinforcement to the buildings was poor. I think this should be highlighted. There are other challenges in our daily work: the availability of power sources and inflation of the currency. This affects during the implementation and the implementation of our construction or shelter projects. These are some photos of the houses that are damaged by the crisis. This is even the pictures, and this house was severely affected with the burns, and on the left, the house was also damaged. See, this is a school. We did the rehabilitation for this school, but this is before the rehabilitation. And this is example of the houses that after the earthquake, that very small little examples, but I think it reflects. Thank you. Over to you, Micheala.
Okay. Thank you both for your presentations. It's quite shocking to see some of the images from on the ground, and thank you for your work in the aftermath of that disaster. I want to turn to Mark first for a question about technologies that are being developed to help us prepare for and respond to earthquakes. So have you, as an expert in this field, have you seen any innovation in the technologies and tools we're using, and has anything come out of this disaster which will help us be better prepared for the next one?
It's a good question. Thank you, Micheala. I think in terms of technology, it's obviously coming more and more into our daily lives everywhere, and so there's no reason why it shouldn't in the search and rescue space and in the engineering and design as it is. As you saw there, the 360 camera that we utilized in Turkey was fantastic. It provides a wireless feed back to a tablet, so somebody can be working from outside of the immediate danger area with only one person within the danger area using the camera. It's got lights and microphones so there can be a two-way conversation with any potential casualties. These are getting better in terms of battery life, in terms of resistance to damage, in terms of size and flexibility. There's a lot of digital data in terms of drone footage and surveys, which is being utilized now. I've seen in recent to get a quick idea of the damage. It'll also give people there on the ground an idea of the full building if they can't get round to the back of the building that they're looking to perform any search and rescue activities on. It will give them insights where it may not be possible to get to. So technology is definitely playing its part and will continue to do so. And it's often getting the technology to the right people at the right place and at the right time. Obviously, there's lots of advanced technology around, but it's often quite expensive and not necessarily in the hands of sort of charities or response teams that are obviously driven by budget and not necessarily have a sort of an open wallet for buying any sort of kit that they require. Coordination is the main thing. Tools that we're seeing for it used to be that in terms of documentation and assessments on the ground, obviously there were paper forms. Now it evolves each time into sort of forms on tablets. They can easily be processed in the cloud, stored so things aren't lost. Battery life is improving. The communication, luckily, the telecommunications during the response in Turkey were still up and running. And so the ability to use WhatsApp as a tool was very beneficial. Good communication between the response teams and between those deploying the tasks could be done much better than, say, in the likes of the post-Nepal earthquake when communication was a challenge. So I think technology is certainly improving every deployment, and we're finding more and more uses for it. That will hopefully continue on that path and allow us to save more lives in the future.
Thank you. So I think you raise a good point around coordination, and I think that was one of the biggest things I learned when looking into responding to international disasters. So Wafa, can you give us some more information on how you coordinate a response to something this big, and how you think we can improve the way we coordinate our responses across different organizations, and especially with so many people working on the ground and so much scattered information?
Thank you for asking. There are platforms for coordination actually between a humanitarian organization for each sector. For example, in UNHCR, and I'm a shelter associate, and we are leading the shelter sector. So we coordinate between all humanitarian organizations regarding any interventions, coordination between the geographical locations. And there are several meetings that are held monthly or bi-monthly sometimes, or ad hoc, depend on the needs. Depends on the needs. So there are platforms for coordination between the humanitarian organization already existed, and they need to be strengthened more, maybe if need be. Thank you.
Thanks. So one of the things that came under scrutiny after this earthquake was the building amnesties in Turkey. And there was a big conversation in the engineering community around the importance of enforcing technical guidelines and building regulations. So Mark, I wonder if you could give some thoughts around the importance of enforcing regulations in mitigating the impacts of earthquakes, and whether you think that the standards that we have now are sufficient for designing against earthquakes in the future.
Sure, and it's a very complex, tricky question to answer, but I'll give it a go and just my thoughts on it. Obviously, I think it's recognised now that if budget and time and cost was no issue, we can build buildings and infrastructure that can withstand the majority of earthquakes that we would experience. most countries would experience. The challenge comes in whether this is possible within a country's budget, within the time frame, and how controlled that is. So the standards all over the world have been improving over the last 20, 30 years, and the guidelines and what's required is set out quite clearly now, I think, if people are able to follow those. In terms of enforcement of the building codes, that is a challenge in itself, especially in more remote regions, especially when cost becomes a driver, and challenges of that nature. But I think there is the information, there are the standards there. It's how it becomes more of not a technical reason. If you ask my opinion, it becomes more of a cultural balance and a regional setting as to how we implement and how we get people to recognize the dangers and find a solution from a cultural perspective, not necessarily a technical perspective, because we can write all the guidelines that we like, but unless they're enforced and the way that they're enforced or incentivized to be enforced, not just the cheapest bid is the winning bid. There needs to be a more than a sort of a short-sightedness, and it needs to be a longer term view taken on all of this, but it becomes more of a social and cultural issue from my perspective than a technical issue.
Yeah, thank you. Wafa, do you have any thoughts on the same question?
I agree with Mark that, as I mentioned also on my presentation, that poverty led to lower the standards of the buildings. So the cost is an issue, and coming up with the innovative ways for better enforcement of the houses without high costs is a very good approach, and of course the scientific laboratories should work on that.
But once you already have a disaster, how do you prepare communities for something like this and make sure that we build their capacity ready for the next time there is a similar situation? Maybe if I come to Wafa first.
Sorry, I disconnected a little bit, maybe from the power from the internet. But I think I understand the question that enhancing the public about the importance of safety of their houses. Actually, I also see the issue from a cultural perspective, or from the support. We have to support the local organizations and local governments through local communities or local organizations. We work here in Syria with local organizations that have impact on the public. They do sometimes they do orientation sessions. They do sometimes like lectures. This has in some cases, like from protection from all other sides, they can do something regarding the awareness of these people for the safety of their houses. Also we can support the local governments. Of course, first of all, we have to eliminate the poverty and support the government's engineering syndicates and the offices that are responsible for these buildings to build better housing conditions and safe housing conditions.
Okay, and in terms of long-term recovery and reconstruction, Mark, what do you think are the key factors we need to consider to ensure that we are building sustainable and resilient communities?
I think that thinking has to start immediately after the earthquake, often, and even before. Be honest, it's part of the long-term resilience and mitigation plan, because one of the issues is that we might have the correct codes now and standards that are sufficient for the potential hazard, but there's obviously the existing infrastructure that may be quite dated. What we do with that and how we mitigate that is obviously very important, and that needs to become part of it. And therefore, for the longer term goal has to be an understanding of what the plan is to build back better, as such, to coin that phrase. How do we build back better, and how do we make sure it's not a sort of a Western dictate as to this is how you do it, obviously, because in a country where you have a lot of money, you can build back better and money is no issue. It has to be, as Wafa referred to and as you alluded to, there has to be local materials, local skill set, and a buy-in from the whole community and a culture to implement solutions that are appropriate and that will work for that country. It cannot be dictated to from another country. It needs to be led from within that country, supported from without if necessary, but it's about training and developing that resilience. We were doing training post the Nepal earthquake, first responder training to the local scouts, monks and Annies, because they are the people there on the ground, and they are the people that can save the most lives within the 24-48 hours, while the international teams are still responding, trying to get into country. So ideally, we get to a point where the international teams are no longer needed. Countries are able to manage their own response efforts, and their infrastructure is resilient enough to withstand any hazards. But we've got a fair amount of work to do then. But it has to be based on that country's capabilities and skill sets, and from a sustainable nature, because otherwise the local communities will not buy into it. And if we can't get that coordination and understanding, then it simply won't work, from my opinion.
Cool. So thanks everyone for answering my questions. I'm going to take some time now to look at the questions that the audience have sent through. Okay, so when we talk about things like climate change, I think there's a lot of discussion now around early warning systems to make sure that we are giving people sufficient time to react and to reduce risk to life. So are there enough early warning systems in place in terms of earthquakes to reduce risk to life? And what do you think could be done better? Maybe if I send this to Wafa. Sorry, Wafa, did you hear my question?
I'm sorry, as I have a connectivity issue sometimes, so I disconnect.
Okay.
So please.
Yeah, I'll just repeat the question. So it was around early warning systems. So do you think there are enough early warning systems in place to reduce risk to life? And what do you think can be done better?
I don't think there's early warning systems. We all witnessed and saw these applications, but I'm sure that in Syria we had this application that about warning for earthquakes, but it's not reliable, and I don't think there's any early warning system. I'm not sure what we can do regarding that. Maybe other colleagues can join in answering that question.
Yeah, I think I was reading as well that it's quite difficult with early warning systems for earthquakes, because obviously you don't necessarily know they're coming, and the amount of time that you can buy is not enough to actually reduce the risk that much. Okay, so because this is a webinar organized by the Young Engineers and Future Leaders Committee, there is obviously a question around youth. So how can youth increase awareness around the importance of proactive preparation for disasters? If I give this to Mark first.
Sure, and I think it has to start there. As I mentioned, as a charity, SARAID, we were targeting the monks, the Annies, the scouts. So children almost sort of from 13, 14 upwards who would be there immediately on the ground, and it's them who've got the best chance to deal with it one, to be prepared, and then two, to be able to be first responders. So absolutely, it's those that might then that take an interest from the first responder training to get involved in disaster management or get involved in the engineering side as a way to drive that information and that learning and education through the communities and expand on it. And I think that's the only way, is to start with the young engineers, or if not before, because they're the future and they're the only ones that are going to be able to change it in the long term.
Great, thank you. So we have a question about how can we adapt the existing non-compliant building stock before the next disaster hits? I'd like to go to you again, Mark, for that one.
Sure. I mean, there are ways to mitigate, relatively straightforward and potentially quite cheap ways to strengthen certain types of building and different mitigation measures. But again, it's got to be appropriate and proportionate to the building stock in that country, because if we just sort of claim we're going to knock down and rebuild everything RC concrete or with mass dampers or with a base isolation, it's just not practical. We need to, if it becomes prohibitive from the start, we will lose any engagement with local communities. And if we say things can only be done by sort of those from a different country, we need to tap into the local skill set from those that construct, those that build these building typologies, understand where they perform better, understand where they could potentially be slightly improved, be it with more mesh, be it with strengthening details. Then again, it has to be engagement at that community local level, potentially fed down from the government level, but it needs to be done holistically across the piece. Otherwise, we've just seen that you don't get the level of engagement that you need to make a real difference across a community and then the wider piece.
Thank you. So I think you mentioned two big stakeholders there, the public and the government. But as the World Federation of Engineering Organizations represents technical institutions, I wonder, Wafa, if you can kind of detail how you see the role of engineering and technical institutions moving forward from this disaster.
Of course, they have a huge role, and they have to be responsible for the designs, and for every engineer should be responsible for the design. There must be a follow-up supervision on the implementation and of all their designs on the ground. So they have a huge role, of course, an ethical role. I guess it's an ethical role before being technical at all.
Well, thank you. So I thought that was quite interesting how you raised about the ethical role. This isn't a question from the audience, but I'd be interested to hear whether you think that engineers need to have more, like in their education, whether we need to embed the more ethics side of things, because at least when I was studying, everything that we learned was quite technical, and we weren't learning about the impact of our work on the public or how to intersect with other stakeholders. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that, Mark.
Yeah, it's a good point, and I think goes back to something that we discussed earlier today, in that the technical solution is only part of the problem, and you can only take it so far, and it then becomes a more social, cultural, ethical issue as to how you implement and what you implement. And so I'd certainly actively encourage engineers to sort of blur the lines with the social sciences to get a better understanding, especially with technology these days and with communications, and what you say is becoming more and more important, because it can create significant good but also significant damage in a very quick and short space of time. So I'd absolutely encourage that learning and that consideration, and branch out of the technical and start understanding how we implement these designs. Is there obviously an optimum design, but might be more difficult to communicate or implement because of various different reasons, and therefore we might have to consider a design that's less optimal from a technical perspective, which is always hard for an engineer to accept, but it might be easily easier to implement and might have a wider reach and therefore create a better overall solution. And it's that sort of wider thinking that we need to encourage, not just from the engineers, but then also the other side of the puzzle as well. And so to get people on the right page, people do have to coordinate and compromise sometimes.
Yeah, I think those are very good points. So looking to wrap up soon, I think one of the key things that needs to come out of big incidents like this is making sure that we learn lessons for the future. I remember seeing in the news a lot comparisons between this earthquake and previous earthquakes, and people questioning like why responses were slower or the number of casualties. And obviously it's very difficult to compare across different contexts, like comparing Turkey to earthquakes in South America. But I wonder if you could give me your top 3 lessons learned from this tragedy that you think that everyone needs to learn from here. So maybe if I go to Mark first.
Okay, I think one thing that we must remember with this earthquake, and all earthquakes and all disasters are different, but the fact that it wasn't just one earthquake in this instance, it was 2 significant earthquakes over a very short period of time within 9 hours of each other, which struck a very similar geographical location. It's not just one earthquake we're referring to in this, so it's very difficult for one reason just to compare directly with others, and hence the death toll was significantly larger. But in terms of my top 3 takeaways, as with most things in life, it comes back to communication initially. The challenges around communication and coordination. My belief is that we will save significantly more lives every time if we can improve our coordination and communication than if we just suddenly had much better trained search and rescue teams, for example. So that would probably be my top one. In terms of the training and the pre-planning and the resilience, we've seen that if countries and if people can take that, get the training in place prior to a disaster and the disaster response plans, whether it's pre-sectorizing a city, then I think that planning is vital. And the last one, I would probably say, is just that patience and understanding that sometimes can get lost. Everybody is there to try to do their best in whatever situation it is. And sometimes that can cloud people's judgment and people can let emotions run their art. So it's always just to remember that patience, understanding, and a bit of humanity with whatever, because we all want the best outcome.
Thank you. And Wafa.
I fully agree with Mark. Coordination is very important. Communication is very important for us in Syria. The coordination, the cross-border coordination was an issue. I think we have to strengthen the cross-border coordination and also the training of the youth. Also, we have to depend on the youth and also we have to do a cultural awareness for these these young people. For organizations, they should have emergency plans for any incident. We shouldn't exclude earthquakes. Actually, in Syria, we forgot about all other crises. We focused on the Syrian conflict, and we didn't prepare very well. Although we thankfully that we did well during the earthquake inside Syria. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both for your wonderful contributions. I've definitely learned a lot about this. And I think a big thing that you've raised that I'll take away from this is that there's a big onus on engineers now, not just to focus on the technical side, but to make sure that we're upskilling and building capacity in line with the community, with the government, and making sure we're communicating well across sectors and silos. I'd like to hand over now to Firas to do a concluding remarks.
Thank you everyone for today's webinar. I believe that the input of everyone was really interesting and engaging. Basically, I would like to thank also President Shehu for his attending and for the opening remarks. And definitely the contribution of Mark and Wafa are very interesting. I guess that basically in concluding this webinar, we can deeply understand that earthquakes have a profound impact on both the affected regions and the international community, and the devastating earthquakes that have struck Turkey and Syria have brought forth important lessons that can help us prepare for the future, respond and recover in the face of such natural disasters. Basically, as a first point, I would like to emphasize that it's crucial to emphasize and prioritize the investment in resilient infrastructure and construction practices. It's very important to have these building codes and standards that need to be strictly enforced, and to ensure that structures can withstand seismic activity. The second point I would like to emphasize on is that early warning systems are very important. Investments in monitoring technologies that can detect seismic activities and provide timely warnings have equal importance. I guess that we need to have also development of public awareness and campaigns to educate communities about the safety measures that need to be taken in earthquakes, also on the evacuation procedures, emergency protocols. A third point I would like also to stress is about the collaboration and coordination among the various stakeholders is very important during and after an earthquake. Coordination between the government, the international organizations, the non-governmental organization, the local communities, all must work together to ensure a swift and coordinated response. And definitely the importance of community resilience can't be overstated here. We need to empower the communities to build their capacity for disaster and response, and we need to encourage the formation of community-based organizations. We need to train local volunteers, young engineers, young peers to establish a community which can significantly enhance resilience, and definitely this will result in reducing vulnerabilities. Also, I would like to share lastly that the most important thing that I believe is the international solidarity and support. They are both crucial in the aftermath of an earthquake. The global community must stand always together to provide humanitarian assistance, financial aid, technical expertise to affected regions. Collaborative efforts can always help expedite the recovery process and ensure long-term reconstruction and rehabilitation. I believe that in conclusion, the earthquakes in the region that happened in Feb 2023 have taught us invaluable lessons about response and recovery, and how to implement these lessons and work together in order to minimize the future, or to minimize the impact of any future earthquakes, and to protect lives. That's all from my side. I would like always to stress that coordination and collaboration between the different international and organizations, whether those part of the WFEO or the wider community, is very important in this regard. And thank you again for this webinar and for your attendance. Thank you very much.